Did you know that the story of one of the bravest women in the Bible was almost erased forever? His name is barely mentioned today, but his courage challenged the most powerful of his time. His story was on the verge of disappearing, and with her, a truth that they don't want you to discover. Why would anyone want to hide it? What secrets hide behind their name? In an era where justice was manipulated by corrupt men, where the voice of a woman was worth less than silence, an unexpected figure rose against oppression. He was not a warrior, with a sword or a queen, with armies under his command. He had no armor or commanded troops, but with a single decision, he unleashed an event that shook the foundations of power and changed the history of his people forever. Susanna was his name. For many, only a forgotten character, a figure of an old story. But what happened to him marked a before and after. In the dark corners of authority, where the judges believed themselves untouchable, she became a threat without proposing it. His virtue and faith were an obstacle to the plans of those who believed that power belonged to them without consequences. But the danger did not come from distant enemies or invading armies. No, the real threat was closer to what I imagined. He was among the elders, among the wise who dictated the law, among those who had to protect the people. And when the trap closed on her, her life hung from a thread. The question was not whether Susanna would be punished, but how much more time could resist before the lie imposed on the truth. Because fate already seemed to be written, unless something impossible happened. The trial was determined before starting. The crowd watched silently, waiting for the outcome of a story that seemed to have only one way, the condemnation. But to understand why Susanna was in this situation, it is first necessary to discover what made her so dangerous for those who ruled with impunity. Because his crime was not a sin, it was something much more serious in the eyes of the corrupt, his virtue. The Bible tells us about many women, but how many of them were persecuted for being fair? Sarah, Abraham's wife, was protected by God even when pharaohs and kings tried to take her. Esther had to hide his identity to save his people, but Susanna did not have a throne or an army behind her. He couldn't hide, and his only weapon was something that his enemies could never control, their unwavering faith. In Daniel 13:2-3, we are told that Susanna was very beautiful and fearful of God. Din, but what really means that description? In ancient times, physical beauty was a symbol of divine blessing. It was believed that those who possessed exterior grace also carried a special heavenly favor. Was that the reason why they covered her? Or was his fear of God that really enraged them? What is rarely mentioned is that Susanna's story was at risk of disappearing. In some ancient writings, it is said that this story was separated from certain sacred texts. Because what truth was in his story that he should not be told? Could it be that their fight against the abuse of being threatened those who wanted to manipulate justice for their benefit? In the Bible, there are cases where the powerful try to silence those who represent true justice. Jeremiah was thrown into a well for speaking the truth, Jeremiah 38:6. John the Baptist was beheaded to challenge Herod, Matthew 14:10. Could Susanna have run the same fate if no one had intervened? But the most disturbing question is this: if its story was almost erased, how many more have been hidden forever? If Susanna's story was about to disappear, what other truths have been hidden? How many times the justice was manipulated by those who had to protect it? What happened with her was not an isolated case. It was not an accident. It was a carefully built trap, a network of lies woven by the same men who swore to defend the truth. The elders of Israel were figures of respect, guardians of the law, those who supposedly watched by the divine will. But as mentioned in Ecclesiastes 3:16, under the sun, in the place of judgment, there is impiety, and in the place of justice, there is iniquity. These men were not interested in the truth, but in power. And when Susanna became an obstacle to their wishes, they knew that there was only one way of getting rid of it. The archaeological evidence of the ancient judicial systems in the Middle East revealed that, at that time, the testimony of two men was sufficient to condemn a person to death. No more evidence was needed. There was no need for physical evidence. Only the word of those considered wise. With this certainty, the corrupt elders devised their plan. If Susanna did not give up to them, they would destroy it in their own words. Daniel 13:15-16 describes the moment when the elderly find their opportunity. They watch her in her private garden at a time of rest, believing that no one sees her. But they are there, hidden in the shadows, like snakes in Eden. Was it a coincidence that this match occurred in a garden, as was the first temptation in Genesis? Or was it a repetition of the same pattern, where corruption was once again devouring innocence? Susanna was alone. Her husband couldn't help her. There were no witnesses in his favor, only two powerful men who could twist reality with a couple of words. And they did. Without hesitation, they shouted to attract the attention of the people. The accusations resonated in the air as an already written sentence. Who would dare to question them? Who could challenge the system without risking everything? Because in that society, challenging power meant facing something even more fearsome, the fate of those who dared to speak. If this story is surprising you and wants to discover more hidden truths in the Bible, make sure you subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. There is much more to reveal, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The voices of the elderly resonated as an unwavering decree. His words, pronounced with the conviction of those who have never been questioned, sealed Susanna's fate in an instant. There was no escape. There was no real trial. In a society where power dictated the truth, innocence was not enough to save anyone. The people gathered quickly. The rumors spread like fire in a dry field. Susanna has been surprised in adultery. An accusation without evidence, but with respected witnesses who would dare to doubt the judges. In Deuteronomy 19:15, it is established that in the mouth of two witnesses or three, the cause will be decided. There was no need to investigate. Susanna was convicted of the tradition itself, but there she was, alone in the middle of a crowd that looked at her with contempt, with amazement, with morbid curiosity. He was not allowed to defend himself. He was not granted the benefit of the doubt. He faced the worst of the elections: yield to lies and save his life, or hold the truth and accept death. How many times has history repeated this pattern? Jose was falsely accused of Potiphar's wife and ended in prison, Genesis 39:20. Naboth was sentenced by corrupt witnesses that obeyed Jezebel, 1 Kings 21:13. Jesus himself was convicted with false accusations because it represented a threat to the system. And now, Susanna was at the same crossroads. His mind was filled with thoughts. He could give in, living with dishonor, becoming another victim silenced by fear, or could resist. But if he did, who would save her? Inside, a certainty burned like a flame. I prefer to fall into the hands of men rather than sin in front of the Lord. Daniel 13:23. He looked up, not with resignation, but with a determination that nobody expected. I wouldn't shout asking for clemency. He would not beg for his life, but I would talk. And when his voice raised for the first time, the fate of all those present began to change. The crowd had already condemned her in her hearts. Whispers, looks of contempt, sentences murmured between teeth. For them, Susanna was already dead. The truth did not matter. The facts did not matter. The word of the elderly was enough. And in a society where the authority was unquestionable, who would dare to challenge her? But then something unexpected happened. From the depths of his being, with the weight of injustice on his shoulders, Susanna shouted. It was not a cry of fear. It was not a cry of despair. It was a clamor directed to heaven, a plea that crossed the veil of reality and touched the divine. O eternal God, who know the secrets and see all things before they happen. Daniel 13:42. His words were like a fire in the middle of the crowd. A tension moment paralyzed the air. In the Bible, there are times when the clamor of the innocents changes the course of history. Abel died unable to defend himself, but his blood cried out from earth. Genesis 4:10. The Israelites groaned in the slavery of Egypt until God listened to their regrets. Exodus 2:23-25. And now, in the midst of an unfair judgment, Susanna's cry broke something that nobody expected. The people were used to seeing convictions, to witness executions as if they were inevitable shows. But there was something in the voice of Susanna that made some stop. Something different, something disturbing. The ancient scriptures speak of God's justice, but they also mention how the powerful tried to twist it to their benefit. How many stories like Susanna's have been silenced? How many times has the truth been buried by those who have control? Susanna's story is not just a story of the past. It is a reflection of what is still happening today. The powerful continue to manipulate the truth. The innocent are still sacrificed in the name of hidden interests. But there is something that few know. Lies always leave cracks. And when the light enters those cracks, the impossible can happen. In the midst of the trial, when everything seemed sealed, an unexpected young man heard that clamor. And that young man was about to challenge everything. The trial advanced as an unstoppable river, dragging Susanna towards an end that seemed inevitable. His cry had pierced the air like a sword, but the people were still caught in the same network. Of lies, no one dared to question the word of the elderly. In that society, challenging authority was to invoke death. But then an unexpected voice broke the silence. It was not that of an old man, nor that of a priest, nor that of a military leader. It was the voice of a young man, Daniel, just a boy, one in the middle of the trial. The crowd turned its head, surprised. How did he dare? Who was he to interrupt the sentence? But his eyes shone with something that few recognized at the beginning: certainty. How foolish are children of Israel, who without examination or knowledge do you condemn a daughter of Israel? Daniel 13:48. In ancient times, the judges were considered the representatives of God on earth. They dictated the fate of men, believed to possess the absolute truth. But in biblical archaeology, tablets and scrolls have been found that demonstrate how judicial systems could be easily manipulated. In many ancient cultures, a simple testimony could mean death without the possibility of appeal. But Daniel did. Not fear. And although he was not yet a prophet, something inside told him that there was a crack in history, a contradiction, a lies hidden among the words of the elderly. In the Bible, God has always used the unexpected to challenge power. Hosea was sold as a slave, but became the second in command in Egypt, Genesis 41:41. Moses stuttered, but released an entire town, Exodus 4:10. David was just a shepherd, but defeated a giant with a stone, 1 Samuel 17:50. And now, Daniel was about to do the impossible, to challenge the judges in their own land. The people held their breath. If the young man was wrong, he would suffer the same destination as Susanna. But if he was right, the elders had never been interrogated, and they were not prepared for what was about to happen. The air became heavy. A restless murmur toured the crowd. No one had ever questioned the judges, nobody. But there was Daniel, a simple young man, challenging those who believed themselves untouchable. If he was wrong, his destiny would be the same as Susanna's. But if he was right, the elders frowned. His robe, impeccable until that moment, seemed now heavier, as if the weight of his own sins began to crush them. But they had lied so many times without being discovered. What could a young man do against them? Separate them away from each other, and I will examine them. Daniel 13:51. A chill toured those present. In biblical archaeology, records of old judgments have been found where sentences were issued without the minimum investigation. Many cases depended only on the word of powerful witnesses. Never before, in the history of Israel, a judge had been interrogated by another man in front of the people. Daniel was doing something unpublished. The elders were separated. And Daniel went to the first. His voice was calm, but his gaze crossed the lie like a sword. Under what tree did you wear to commit the fault? The old man did not hesitate. Under a lentisco. The people nodded. If a judge claimed it, it should be true, or not. Then Daniel walked to the second old man. The air was loaded with tension. And you? Under what tree? The old man did not hesitate. Under an oak. Silence, and suddenly the truth fell on the crowd as a lightning in the dark. Two men, two different versions, one destination. In the law of Moses, a false witness had to receive the same punishment he had wanted to impose on his victim. Deuteronomy 19:18-19. The elders had sentenced Susanna to death. Now, his own judgment was in the hands of the town. Fear clouded his faces. For the first time in their lives, those who controlled justice were helpless before it. The crowd, which previously watched with indifference, now woke up from his blindness. But there was still an unanswered question. What would they do with those who had betrayed the confidence of the people? The silence was absolute. The truth, naked and evident, floated in the air as an irreversible sentence. The elders, the same ones who had issued judgments for years, were now cornered by their own lie. Susanna, the woman who minutes ago was condemned without a defense, was still standing, not because of the mercy of men, but because God's justice had acted through the unexpected. But was it just luck, or was there something deeper behind all this? Susanna's story is a warning. In the Bible, God does not always use kings or warriors to change the fate of a people. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not to raise a sword, but to remain firm when everything is against. Moses challenged the Pharaoh with nothing more than his faith. Esther risked his life when he appeared before the king. And now, Susanna had resisted when the whole system was pushing her to death. What few know is that their history was on the verge of being eliminated from sacred texts. In some ancient translations, Susanna's story does not appear in Daniel's book. Because what did his story so uncomfortable for some? Could it be because it showed that corruption not only lived in the enemies of Israel, but within its own people? The present is not so different. Throughout history, how many innocent have been silenced by those who control the narrative? How many times the truth has been manipulated to serve the interests of a few? Susanna is not just a figure of antiquity, it is the symbol of all those who have been unfairly accused, of all those who have been forced to choose between their life and their honor. And although its story had a different end than expected, the danger had not yet disappeared. Because where there is power, there will always be those who try to corrupt it. And the question is, will anyone dare to face them? Susanna's story did not end its acquittal. It wasn't just an isolated event in time. Something deeper had happened that day. Something that few understood at the time, but that would resonate over the centuries. Because the real question is not only how it was saved, but why its history was almost eliminated from the Bible. In some old versions of the scriptures, Susanna's story does not appear in Daniel's book. Some manuscripts completely exclude it as if it had never existed. Was it a simple transcription error, or did someone try to erase it intentionally? In biblical history, it is not the first time that something like this happens. The Enoch book, which mentions the rebellious rebellion, was discarded from many official canons. The Dead Sea manuscripts revealed texts that had been hidden for centuries. And in the history of Jesus, the apocryphal Gospels narrate episodes that the Christian tradition decided not to include in the scriptures. How many truths have been suppressed? How many stories have been buried so that no one questioned them? But Susanna's case is even more intriguing, because she was not a prophet. He was not a queen or a warrior. It was just a woman who challenged power with the only weapon she had, the truth. And perhaps that is the real reason why some wanted their history to disappear, because Susanna was not saved by a visible miracle or by the intervention of an angel. It was a man a young man without authority who saw the crack in lies and had the courage to act. It was not the temple or the priests who protected it, but the determination of someone who did not fear to challenge the system. And this opens a disturbing question. If its story was almost erased, how many more have been silenced without us knowing it? Because where there is power, there will always be those who try to control the truth. And if Susanna's story taught us something, it is that justice depends on those who have the value of opening their eyes. But will anyone more dare to do it? If Susanna's story was almost erased, how many others have been silenced without us knowing? How many times has the truth been deformed by those who have power? The past is full of secrets, but the present is no different. Corruption did not disappear with the elders of Israel. The abuse of power did not end with them. The same patterns have been repeated throughout history, changing face, adapting to new times, hiding behind new masks. Today, justice is still manipulated. Innocent is condemned while the guilty walk free. Stories are rewritten to hide what bothers. Silence is dared to challenge the system. And the question that remains is the same as Susanna faced that day: surrender or resist, because it is not just the story of an unjustly accused woman. It is the story of anyone who has been unjustly pointed out, of anyone who has felt the weight of the lie crushing the truth. It is the story of each person who has been forced to choose between his life and his honor. But there is something else, something that few have understood. Susanna was not rescued by a visible miracle, or by the intervention of a king, or by the compassion of her executioners. It was the determination of someone who decided not to silence what saved her. Daniel had no power, he had no authority, but he had something that others did not have: the courage to question. And here is the real lesson: it is not enough to see injustice. You have to face her, because if we shut up today what is wrong, tomorrow will be too late. So the final question is not what happened to Susanna. The real question is, what will you do when your turn to speak? Now that you know the truth about Susanna, then tell me in the comments, what would you have done instead? Would you have had the courage to challenge injustice? Your opinion is important, because the story is still alive in every decision we make today. Do not forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, and see you in the next hidden mystery in the Bible.